Hello everyone. In this video I'm looking to outline cards that you should be aware of when you make the transition from startup to standard. Startup is a really good format. I enjoy running tournaments in it. I think it's a really great way to learn and get started in Netrunner. But I also think there's a lot of really compelling cards and parts of the game in standard that are not present in startup at the moment. And there's not a lot of resources out there for making the jump from startup, which has a relatively small card pool, to standard, which has a card pool that's I think almost 3 times the size. This video cannot be comprehensive and will probably pretty rapidly be out of date. And ban lists can change the meta and what cards are in power, but I think my goal here is to give you an overview of some of the power cards in all of the factions, just to get some sense of what to be aware of when you sit down against an opponent who's playing a standard list, what sort of gotchas might be out there that you might not get from just looking over the several hundred cards that make up standard at the moment. I'm not going to try and cover what the meta decks are. I think I did a video about the Fight Night decks that I think give a good snapshot of the meta recently. This is really just kind of trying to focus on the cards themselves. I'm going to go sort of by faction in mostly alphabetical order, though a little bit out of order for things, sort of depending on my whim. But I'm going to start actually with Corp Neutrals, because I think Corp Neutrals have some of the highest impact on the game, because right now, the way the Corp Neutrals are designed, they go well in almost every faction and give the Corps a lot of extra power that they're lacking in startup. So there are 3 cards I'm going to cover in the Corp Neutrals. The first one is Rashida Jaheim. So Rashida, I think basically since release, has been one of the first cards you think about putting in your Corp deck, and almost every Corp deck is running 3x. I think arguably Rashida Jaheim might be played more than Hedge Fund, though I don't think that's actually true. I think it's close to true of high-level decks, where Rashida Jaheim fits in asset spam strategies and sort of glacier strategies and combo strategies in a way that Hedge Fund doesn't always. So this is a card I think you should always put in your Corp deck and then take out later if you find it's just something that isn't useful for you. Next up, we have NGO. This card's not at the same power level as Rashida Jaheim, but does give the Corp, especially Glacier Corps, a lot of options for generating extra econ and forcing the runner to go through their scoring remote an extra 1 to 3 times over the course of a game. This is really powerful because Glacier Corps sort of live and die by their ability to force the runner to respect the remote, and NGO forces them to check another time unless they have some way to sniff out if it is an NGO or if it's an agenda. Another nice thing about NGO is it's a paid ability to trash to gain the credits, so often you can just also install it naked and the runner will know that you have econ on the board, but essentially they cannot stop it in any way. They can run the NGO to make you pop it early, which is often what you'll see runners do in certain board states, but the Corp still gets the money. And the last neutral card, I think, is probably... Rashida is a very controversial card. This card is as well. This is Global Food Initiative. This text might seem fairly modest, right? It's a 5/3 that then says, oh, but I'm only worth 2 points for the runner's score area. But this actually has a huge warping effect on basically the entire card pool. This means that if you put 3 of these in your corporation deck, the runner is playing against a 17-point corporation, and you get to play a 20-point corporation. That just means, in some ways, it's easier for you to score. So there's a scoring pattern for the Corp where they can score the Global Food Initiative and then 2 2-pointers, and so they've scored 3 agendas, but the runner is always going to have to score 4 agendas to win the game. And that changes the game a lot. For a lot of Netrunner, it's sort of been the assumption that both the Corp and the runner have to score the same amount of agendas. The other thing GFI does is in decks that have basically no scoring plan or no way to score a 5/3, this lets other corporations have the agenda density that's much lower. They basically get to cut a whole agenda, fit an extra card of power into their deck, and still require the runner to score a lot. So this card has been talked about being banned a bunch. I think it ended up on a restricted list at some point, and it doesn't go in every deck, but it does change dramatically what decks are viable and can be played in the meta. But that's sort of the major Corp Neutral cards that I think see a ton of play and you will see all over the place. There are definitely other impactful ones, but like I said, I'm trying to just highlight some of the biggest key cards to be aware of as you make the jump from startup to standard. In startup, HB is really strong because of precision design, which is sort of a rush glacier style deck where I can just make a really impenetrable scoring remote very quickly and cheaply, and then use neutral agendas to power through. In standard, that's still one of the best decks in the format, but then there are also other decks that do quite well. And so I'm going to cover some of the stuff that makes that work, but HB really has a broad range of game plans in standard, and so I can't cover the breadth of cards. But a lot of them are also, a lot of the cards that make HB sing right now are startup legal, so you'll be at least familiar with them. So the first HB card I'm going to talk about is the ID Asa. This ID has been up and down in power since its release, but particularly with the release of Fully Operational, people started realizing this was a really, really good sort of asset spammy style ID. Basically, it lets you have 4-click turns, and that's a big deal. Rashida is probably one of the reasons this ID is wildly strong, because you get to install Rashida and install Nice Protecting It for a single click, and then you can pay a lot of money to protect that Rashida, and you'll get the cards and credits back to do that again, or just continue to build up your board state. And you only invested a single click in that Rashida and Ice, so if the runner does go and trash it, they've probably invested more than you have. ASA right now supports a bunch of different archetypes just due to the strength of its ID, Fully Operational, and some of the other cards in the HB pool. Next up, we have Sports Medal. This ID has been used for lots of different things. It's been used both as sort of a fair, or a more kind of fair tempo favored ID, with the idea that, yeah, if both the runner and Corp are playing fair, this will probably trigger 6-ish times per game. So that's 12 credits or 12 cards or somewhere in between. Game Changer recently got banned, so that was a version of the deck that was less fair and would run, try and make the runner steal 4 or 5 agendas, and and then score out a bunch of agendas all at once on the final turn. And there's some other people have been finding that this deck is still resilient even without Game Changer, as you can sort of see in the Fight Night video I did a while back. Those are sort of the two major IDs to be aware of as you make the jump from startup to standard. Moving on to some of the power cards, I'm actually only listing 3 for HB, because a lot of the power cards that are working right now are also startup legal, and also one of the other ones I would have mentioned, Fairchild 3.0, just got banned. So the first one is Jeeves Model Bioroids. This one you'll see in a lot of different sort of asset spammy archetypes, because this Jeeves model lines up really well with what those decks want to do. They often want to spend entire turns installing cards out, or entire turns drawing back up, or even sometimes using the Jeeves as sort of a pseudo pad campaign where you click for credits 3 times and then you get an extra click to use to even just take a 4th credit. The other thing that Jeeves lets you do is if you have a 4-2 on the board, you can never advance it, and then you just install it on one turn, the next turn you can advance it 4 times because you have a Jeeves on the board. And that's one of the main ways that asset decks are scoring right now. So Jeeves you'll see both in faction and out of faction. Next up we have MCA. This is another really big HB card, and is probably the only card that subtracts clicks from the runner that's, I should say directly, that really sees a lot of play. This card is astounding in Mirror Morph because you can, after the turn you res it, you click it, next turn you click it again, then on the 3rd turn you can click it twice and score a 5/3 from hand. which is amazing. For everyone else, for every other HB Corp, they have to wait an extra turn or have achieved on the board to score that quickly. And this effect also ends up changing stuff for cards we'll talk about on the runner side that require you to run all 3 centrals and then play a card. This means that the runner has to have a way of gaining an extra click. So MCA basically becomes an agenda that you install because it can score a 5/3 from hand. You have to protect it just like an agenda, but the downside of failing to protect it is so much lower, it makes this card pretty fantastic. The final HB card I'm going to talk about is Gatekeeper. There's a lot of different ice you could talk about, I think, for HB, but a lot of the ones that are seeing a lot of play right now that aren't Gatekeeper are also startup legal or sort of neutral or splash from out of faction. Gatekeeper I think is really impactful because it has the potential to be a tempo positive piece of ice for the corporation, in addition to having an end the run subroutine on it. So this both forces the runner to find a code gate breaker, and if they face check without it, paying 3 credits to draw 3 cards is an exchange you often want to make as the corp, and being able to also shuffle back agendas is a huge deal. So now going on to Jinteki. Jinteki feels like almost an entirely different faction in Standard, in part because some of the cards are so defining for the faction that Startup, when being designed, presumably was balanced around these cards existing in the Standard pool and meant that you couldn't push them in quite the same way. So the very first card is Obokata Protocol, and this agenda is probably one of the most defining agendas for a faction that's been printed. Because the net damage, the 4 net damage, is part of the cost to steal this agenda, and it is always active, there's very, very few ways to cheat that cost. So this allows Jinteki decks to play both in the I'm going to run your deck out of cards, and once you have fewer than 4 cards left in your hand or deck, I can now just score this off the board for free. Or it can allow them to turn all of their net damage ice, which is usually much cheaper than end the run ice for the same like res to break cost for the runner. It allows them to turn all that net damage ice into effective end the run ice when they're trying to score an Obokata Protocol. This agenda basically changes the whole way that Jinteki plays and makes a lot of the net damage stuff that feels sort of irrelevant or can feel irrelevant in Startup into incredibly relevant sort of resource that the runner has to manage. Next up we have Anansi, and this is another wild piece of ice. It's probably one of the strongest ice ever printed. Its biggest downside is that it is 8 credits to res, but it is basically immune to almost every cheat in the game. If you bypass Anansi in any way, its clause of doing 3 net damage fires. If you face check without a breaker down, it fires. You cannot, if you break 2 of the 3 subroutines of the boomerang, you're still going to take at least 3 net damage. And when the subs do fire, they're amazing for the corporation player. So this ice is pretty wildly strong. Another thing to mention is that it is a sentry, which is historically one of the cards, the type of ice that most factions struggle with the most and have the least efficient breakers for. You will see this in a lot of Jinteki decks, and it's something you should be prepared to hit. You can face tank Anansis, and good players, I think, often will face tank Anansi because the 8 credit swing that the corporation is spending is a big deal. But it's something to particularly be aware of when you're playing against Jinteki. This ice is a lot scarier than basically any of the ice you're used to running against in Startup. So now I'm going to circle back and do the identities for Jinteki, because I think, those Anansi and Obokata Protocol do the most definition for the faction as a whole. And then we sort of have a couple of cards that sort of fill in to round out the faction a little bit. One of the reasons that Startup Jinteki is poor is because Palana exists. This ID is often worth 9 to 15 credits over the course of a game. which is crazy. It comes at no deck building cost. You get to run your 45-15 and do whatever game plan you want and just have more money than you would playing any other ID in the game, basically. Runners play around this ID when possible, especially, elite players, where they will alternate turns where they draw. So they'll have a turn where they basically just only draw, and then turns where they only play and run and stuff like that. But even in that case, Piranha is changing the flow of the game and forcing the runner to respond to your tempo, and if they don't, they're giving you a lot of extra cash. So this ID is really good and allows you to take Jinteki's somewhat meager economy cards and stretch them a lot further and allow you to res your expensive Anansis. Next up we have Ag Infusion. Unlike Piranha, it doesn't make money, but it has sort of more interesting text on it, I guess. You can use unres ice that maybe the runner has a breaker out for, so it's just not worth resing to make them just spend a couple credits to break. You can now turn that unres ice into effectively a soft end the run. You can just boop them over to a server that's got no ice, or that you don't care about what it has, or if you have a res Anansi, you get to run them right over into that Anansi over and over again. Well, once per turn, but once per turn over and over again. So Ag Infusion and Piranha both are very common Glacier IDs in Jinteki. And sort of which one you prefer, which one is stronger, is sort of always up in the air, and good players will tell you both can be strong at different times. For the last card I'm going to mention is DNA Tracker. This is basically a Nazis 4 through 6. It's not quite as good and saw almost no play with Engram Flush and Slot Machine in the meta, but given that both of those cards are banned, DNA Tracker could maybe sneak in, and this is a pretty punishing face check, and it also falls outside the normal color pie, so it's just a card to be aware of. But that wraps it up for Jinteki, so I'm going to move on to NBN. Alright, so NBN has probably two of the most game-defining and warping cards in it, and so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on them. But also that means I'm going to talk about some of the other kind of key cards in NBN, maybe a little bit less, because I want to focus a little more on these key cards. So the first one is Hard-Hitting News, and I think this is probably one of the most polarizing cards that has been printed post the first FFG rotation that has never been banned or restricted. This card, basically, giving the runner 4 tags for a single click, admittedly it has to be your last click for the turn, is really, really strong. And there are players that absolutely hate Hard-Hitting News, and then there are other sets of players who think it's a fantastic effect to have to the game, or at least is an effect that is good to have in the game, even if maybe this implementation isn't the best possible one. I personally was really frustrated by HHN for a long time, and then I sort of stopped and asked good players and started watching good players play, and it's actually a card that the runner can play around and creates a new and interesting dynamic when both players are aware of it and are trying to play around the existence of this card. That said, it's going to be very frustrating when you start out, so I want to give a little bit of advice for how to handle it. So against an NBN deck, almost always they're going to have at least one Hard-Hitting News, probably 2, and many of them 3. One of the things that's unique about Hard-Hitting News is basically if the corporation tags you, or if the corporation lands the Hard-Hitting News, you have to have a plan for how you're going to deal with those 4 tags. So your options are, have a way to deal with those 4 tags, and that can be, I have 8 credits, and I don't mind spending an entire turn clearing those tags, and that is often a really good line of saying, yeah, I've got 8 to 16 to 20 credits, and maybe, yeah, the corporation has 30, so they can force the Hard-Hitting News to land, but I'll just spend my whole turn clearing tags, and, basically, the corporation gets a 5-click turn. And that is sometimes how Hard-Hitting News is used. Another thing that you can do is if you know what tag punishment is on or available to the corp, you can float the tags for a little while and then clear them slowly over time. You can go tag me, or what you can do is plan very intentionally when you want to, what turns you want to run and what turns you don't want to run. If you have a daily cast you want to install, it's probably a turn not to run, because the daily cast is going to put you back 3 credits for fighting the hard-hitting news trace. So, a common play pattern in startup is I'm going to run, I'm going to draw a card, I'm going to run twice, I'm going to install my daily casts. That's not very good against NBN decks in particular, because you're actually setting yourself back on credits for breaking the trace. So that first turn, maybe you run, and instead of installing the daily cast, you just click for a credit, and then next turn you can click for some more credits or draw some cards and install your daily cast then, and intentionally not make any runs. So, Hard-Hitting News is a card you have to learn to play around and changes the play style, but I think ultimately makes tags a much more interesting dynamic than they are in startup, and there are cards that key off of having many more tags, which is something that startup doesn't really have at the moment. Next up is another, probably the most game-warping corporation ID in the entire list. Basically, this adds a click and credit and 2 credit cost to the first asset trashed each turn, or you are going to be paying into the trace of 3 or 4 credits most of the time. Tag punishment, in startup is pretty meek and sort of lacking, but there's a much more powerful tag punishment in standard, which I'll kind of get to over the course of the game. But this is, one of the defining ideas, because it lands tags so reliably and consistently against basically every runner. At some point, the runner will probably end up going tag me, where they just have all the tags in the world, and then it's up to CTM to turn those tags into wins. Learning to play against CTM is a really involved task. I can't really give a short summation. I'm going to link Whiteblade's article, How to Play Against Horizontal Decks, where he talked about CTM specifically. But the sort of super condensed cliff notes is you have to learn what cards to trash. In some board states, there's just a couple of key cards you can trash. Sometimes if you're really ahead, you want to cement that advantage by trashing their economy, and sometimes you just have to go tag me and hope that you win on accesses and centrals before the corporation can land their tag punishment or win the game. Also, if you want to trash an asset, I would generally recommend trying to trash at least 2 assets on a single turn, so that second asset you're not paying the CTM tag cost. Now, do be aware that you also have to keep in mind they will be running hard-hitting news, so if trashing 2 assets allows them to land a hard-hitting news that they wouldn't have been able to land with just trashing 1, maybe don't run it. Next up, I'm going to talk about some of the tag punishment that NBN has in faction, and we'll talk about some of the out-of-faction tag punishment later. But there are basically 3 cards that function as tag punishment. Exchange of Information, Market Forces, and Psychographics is the one card that I'm going to mention that's in startup, but I think looks so completely different in standard as to be a different card. So all 3 of these cards either score you points or radically change credit totals in a way that allow you to score more points. Exchange of Information works off of a single tag. Market Forces and Psychographics scale with the number of tags, which is one of the reasons that sort of CTM and other NBN decks can go very heavy on multi-tags, because with Psychographics they can score a Beal for 7 points in some cases, often less. But now I'm going to talk about 2 tagging ice that see a lot of play and that you just should be aware of. The first is IP block. This is a card that I've complained about and had complained about to me a lot, but it's a powerful card. It is a sort of Eli-like barrier in that the runner can just pay through it. Eli, the runner can just click through it. But IP block is also really nice because it costs less res than Eli. It because of particular AIs that are powerful in standard, or really a particular AI that's powerful in standard. the sort of non-subroutine text is usually relevant. And it's expensive for a lot of breakers to handle. So this card is just situated really nicely to do a lot of different things that NVN wants, and you'll often see this splashed in other factions because of how it hates on AI, and to some extent the weakness of barriers that are available to other factions. The other ice I'll mention is just Turnpike. It's really solid for a lot of NBN plans because when you think about hard-hitting news as being one of the center points of the faction, that's all about creating credit differential, and Turnpike is really good for creating a credit differential because it traces, or it costs the runner a credit, and then if they don't have a breaker out, they're taking a tag, so they have to spend a bunch more resources to handle that tag. NBN has a lot of stuff going on, and I'm barely scratching the surface here, but hard-hitting news and CTM are basically the reason I felt like I wanted to make this video, so that's why I spent so much time on them, and I'm spending less time on some of the other pieces in the NBN color pie. Moving on to Weyland, the first pair of cards I'm going to talk about is Boom and High Profile Target. These are inheritors to a card called Scorched Earth, and basically define a whole archetype just by existing. And these cards fill what's often called a tag and bag deck. Both of these cards generate value off of the runner having to have multiple tags, and then turn that into I win the game. With HHN, it's really hard to land multiple tags without the runner having at least a turn to respond. So to make these impactful, often Corps will look to sort of force the runner to make tough choices, where they will install advanced an agenda in their scoring remote and then play hard-hitting news and tell the runner, you can either clear all the tags or you can contest my scoring remote, but you can't do both. And this has been a really fun and interesting play style for a lot of people. And you can play it both out of Weyland, splashing in hard-hitting news, or you can play it in NBN, splashing in the Boom or High Profile Target. The next card, Economic Warfare. This card isn't seeing a ton of play at the moment, but has historically had a place in the tag and bag archetypes because it basically is a hedge fund that pays out twice as much when you're trying to land hard-hitting news. There's not that much more to say about this. It's just a really solid card for decks that are looking to land hard-hitting newses to kind of flatline the runner. Next up, I'm going to talk about Border Control. This card gets splashed around a lot and is a really powerful end the run effect because it both serves as a gear check where the runner has to have a barrier breaker or an AI to handle it, and then when the runner does handle it, you can force them to run again. Not every deck wants this effect, but there are decks that do, and when they do, this card can be really powerful. This card, I will note, does not combo with Anoetic Void or Managarm Skunkworks. You have to use the Border Control before either of those would fire. And actually some of the run timing restructuring, I think, was to make it so that this was the case. Next up, I'm going to talk about the outfit. This is probably the default Weyland ID right now, and it's the only Weyland ID I have on the list, because Weyland has really historically actually not been that strong, and then also two of the strongest Weyland IDs have been banned, or actually there are two banned Weyland IDs right now, and then another one that was rotated very early in its life. The outfit is, I think, to me, I think one of the most fun quintessential kind of themes of Weyland, which is kind of live fast and die young. The outfit, is going to generate a lot of bad publicity, especially with Too Big to Fail, which is also on the screen here. Too Big to Fail allows the corporation to basically make 9 credits for a single click, which is wildly strong. Switching over to runners, I'm actually going to talk about significantly fewer cards per runner side per runner faction than Corps, in part because actually runners tend to sort of do two things. One is a lot of runners right now are sort of running the same kind of fundamental game plan of make a lot of money and hope that solves all the problems the Corp can present me, which right now kind of can, but hasn't always historically been true. The other thing is that runner strategies tend to be a little more niche and will like kind of pop up and be good and then get kind of fall out of the meta very rapidly based on what the Corp is doing. So I'm actually going to, for example, Hive Mind Max, I'm going to highlight basically none of the key cards in that list. Like Hive Mind doesn't quite meet the bar. It was basically unplayable. I put in strong quotes, jank. Up until the release of Gateway, where it got a whole bunch of extra synergies that suddenly made it work. And so, I'm trying to highlight the key cards to be aware of, but there's a lot of richness in Standard that I'm just not able to cover in a video of this length. So I'm going to start with Anarchs. So Anarch is about to undergo a big change for the next rotation with Order and Chaos rotating, but up until that point they have a lot of impactful IDs and a lot of impactful cards that shape basically not just their faction, but every piece of every Corp card I think that has basically been printed. There are 4 IDs, the most of any faction, that are impactful for Anarch. The first 2 are from Order and Chaos, and these are due to rotate with the release of Nisei's next product. The first one is Max, of the aforementioned Hive Mind Max. Max has historically been a very popular sort of, it's being right now used in an engine deck, but historically Max has had a lot of different faces and sort of deck archetypes. Almost all of them revolve around this idea that having cards in your heap has often meant that they're more accessible to you than when they're 20 cards down in your deck. And so, you can use other tools in the game to get cards from your archives into the play area. There's not a lot of ways to get stuff that's buried in your deck into the play area without clicking to draw. So Max gives you that draw and also mills cards out as sort of a strict benefit. And this ID draws, somewhere between 1 and 3 cards a turn, depending on how your deck is constructed and what cards are in Standard. The next runner, also from Order and Chaos, which is due to rotate next, is Valencia, or Val. And she is sort of one of the quintessential value runners. With the idea, basically, her ID says, effectively, you get 1 extra credit on every run you make over the course of the game. And so a lot of Valencia's strategies are just decks are just the idea of, I'm just going to use that value to disrupt, to make lots of runs and win off of making lots of cheap, slightly more efficient than every other runner in the game runs. And right now, when the meta is focused a lot on the Corps and the runners playing sort of a value game against each other and see who can generate the more value to win, the 50 card deck size is obviously a downside, and there were cards in the previous rotation that made this less of a downside. But even in this world with slightly less draw for Anarch, Valencia is still a really powerful and notable ID, particularly for a card I will be talking about next, which is Rebirth. Rebirth is not an ID, but this is a card that allowed Valencia and any other Anarch, Hoshiko is often a runner that will also play Rebirth, to swap to one of the next 2 Anarch IDs I'm going to talk about. Rebirth is starting to see play outside of Anarch, but this has effectively been an Anarch card for most of its lifespan. So the primary target that Anarchs are rebirthing into is Omar. Omar is really, really impactful because he says, now you don't just need to protect HQ and R&D, you also need to protect archives. And turning into Omar in the mid-game is often the most powerful thing that you can possibly do with a rebirth. Even if other things look situationally better at that moment, having the long-term ability to force the Corp to shore up 3 centrals as well as their scoring remote or whatever the rest of their board state looks like is so disruptive as to just rule out anything else you're going to swap into. Some people will actually start as Omar, though the influence cost is obviously a notable downside. But the rebirth into Omar is sort of one of the staple points of power for Anarch as a whole. The last Anarch ID, and is also sometimes a rebirth target, but is often an ID you actually just start and finish a game as in Anarch, is Freedom. Trashing Corp cards is really good. You've done probably a little bit of that in Startup with Imp, and Freedom just says, you know, if I can make runs, and the key card for Freedom is Yusuf, which is on the screen, which allows him to break barriers, but also just generate more virus counters that he can then use to trash more cards. One of the big things that Freedom has over some other Anarch IDs is he allows you to make the choice of what to trash, which is much more impactful than some of the other Anarch IDs. People often think of, oh, I need to build a virus deck around Freedom, but really most Freedom decks look basically like Reg Anarch, or like other Anarch decks, with the addition of a card like Yusuf or an extra reliance on cards like Leech to generate just the few extra virus counters that make Freedom sing. Anarch has, I think, the most cards of any faction across everything across the list. And this next set of 3 breakers, Paperclip, Black Orchestra, and MK Ultra, sometimes called the Conspiracy Breakers, these breakers, I think, have defined Standard more so than almost any other card. Particularly Black Orchestra has defined what code gates can be printed. MK Ultra, to some extent, has defined what sentries can be printed, and Paperclip has basically said that barriers cannot be printed and be relevant in the game. Essentially, that you can discard these breakers, and then when you encounter the piece of ice of the corresponding subtype, you get to pay to install them, and then pay to break them. Black Orchestra and MK Ultra are not wildly efficient, but the fact that you can have your breaker in the heap is just such a powerful effect for the runner. You don't have to install it until the corporation shows you a thing that you can break it with. And so you're not, even compared to something like SMC, I don't need to have it. It's much easier to get a card in the heap than to keep it in the deck. You will draw cards, and you have to draw cards, and that can turn off your SMC. And even just having the threat of it right there and installing for much cheaper than you would with SMC makes these cards just pretty nuts. And so stuff like 4 strength code gates fell out of the meta completely because Black Orchestra, the first time you encountered a code gate, the Anarch just broke it for 6, spending no clicks. And a big part of the cost of the way that the sort of game has historically worked before these breakers was that ice was balanced around the fact that the runner had to spend an extra click and credits to install their breaker before they could get through your ice again. And these breakers just say, no, that's not the case. And these breakers obviously make a card like Max even stronger. And then there are other cards that, this card makes moshing, and other cards like it look even better for Anarch, where you're trashing your own cards from hand, and turning that downside into actual positive value for yourself as the runner. The next Anarch card I'm going to talk about is Hippo. Ice Destruction was originally a big part of the Anarch color pie with Parasite, and Hippo was one of FFG's attempts to replace it. They had several, and Nisei's had some as well. But I think Hippo is the piece of Ice Destruction that has seen the most play, and one of the ones that I like most, though I would love to see Parasite come back. Hippo particularly allows the inefficient breakers, Black Orchestra and MK Ultra, to be stretched a little bit further, because when they break the ice once, they then get to destroy the piece of ice, assuming it's the outermost. As a corporation player, one thing to keep in mind is if you have an ice that is going to be expensive for the runner to go through long term, but if it's the only ice you have installed on that remote, so if you res it now, the runner will just destroy it once with the Hippo. What you can do is, the next time you draw an ice, you can install it in front of the valuable ice you care about, and just never res that new outermost piece of ice, because Hippo only works on the outermost and only the first outermost they break each turn. And then I'm going to talk about 2 sort of value cards for Anarch, but they're really kind of key to the faction. The first one is I've Had Worse. This is a draw card and a damage protection card all in one. It doesn't protect you against Boom, for example, because Boom does 7 damage all at once, but against high-profile target, or a lot of the Jinteki sort of ping damage cards, I've had worse is amazing because it'll just draw you. You know, the corporation is spending money to do a damage to you, and you say, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll take your 1, 2, 3 damage, whatever," and I would just get to draw 3 cards for free off of that, which is really good. And then also you have Zero, which you know, in startup you have professional contacts. Zero is basically professional contacts, but it costs 1 credit to install, which means it pays back so much faster. The other thing is, often when you're clicking to draw because the cards in your hand aren't doing anything for you. So discarding one of them to draw 2, even at random, is better than drawing 1 card and gaining 1 credit. So Zero is one of the highest value cards in the game, and it also synergizes with I've Had Worse, so that you can draw 4 cards for 1 click while gaining a credit, which is just pretty wild. But that's it for Anarch, and I'm going to move on to Criminals. Alright, Criminal, I actually don't have a lot of cards to talk about, because a lot of the Criminal cards are sort of like, that are played a lot in Standard, are sort of these incremental value cards, or cards that you've seen in Startup already. But there are 3 really important cards that you will see almost every game you play against a criminal or play as a criminal. The first one is Diversion of Funds. This card has defined the faction since it was printed, which it was printed to fill the hole that Account Siphon used to fill before FFG rotated Account Siphon. You'll often see this called Doof. I couldn't tell you where the extra O comes from, but it is often how I will refer to the card. This card I think is less fun than Account Siphon. Account Siphon actually let you win the game. Diversion of Funds just lets you extend the game. Diversion of Funds is really powerful as the criminal player, because if the corporation is trying to score out of the remote, you can play Diversion of Funds to force them to protect HQ. Otherwise, they may not have the credits to actually keep you out of the remote. And so this is sort of the way that Criminal plays in Standard, is bouncing between R&D, HQ, and the remote, trying to keep the corporation from ever having enough money to really build up the momentum they need to score. And this card is going to take practice to learn how to play, when to play, and how to play around, but is sort of probably the most defining card at the moment for the Criminal faction. Amakua, though, the next card, is the other card I think that actually has a argument as being the other most defining card, and is also probably the strongest breaker in the format, and probably the strongest AI breaker ever printed. Come at me, Faust haters. In my notes I have the game is called Netrunner, not Netdrawer, and I have that written because Amakua synergizes with the Make a Run action, which is the most powerful action for the runners. It's how you win the game in virtually every deck. And Amakua synergizes really well with stuff you're already doing in Startup as Criminal. Because, you know, maybe you're running Penny Shaver, maybe you're running other consoles that synergize with Run Event, with making runs. You're probably running some amount of Leech or Dirty Laundries, or, you know, these cards that get Bravados. All of those things give you values for making runs, particularly making successful runs, and Amakua says, once you get your first couple of successful runs, I'll start breaking all ice for you incredibly cheaply. Just 1 credit for 1 subroutine once you get me to strength. So Amakua really has been, along with the Conspiracy Breakers, defining what corporation ice can get printed since its release. Because low strength ice really struggles in the world with Amakua, and this is like the card that makes Gatekeepers falling to 0 strength a huge downside, because it allows Amakua criminals to face tank the Gatekeeper, and as long as the game isn't over, for the rest of the game, they get to recharge their Amakua by running through the Gatekeeper. An important distinction between Amakua and a card like Hoshiko, Amakua is actually gets counters if you go to the access phase, or the access step, not whether or not you actually access any cards. The exposed text on Amakua is not relevant for most runners, but is very relevant for what is effectively the default criminal ID in Standard, which is 419. 419 is basically the default because you get either one of 2 things. Either the corporation is is paying an extra credit almost every turn to play the game they would normally want to play, and Netrunner is usually thin enough that accumulating 1 credit over the course of the game is just monumental. Or the corporation is giving you information about the way stuff is set up, which makes you as the criminal have a much easier time of evaluating threats and risks to all of your actions, which should lead you to kind of get easier wins. And then if you do get to install an Amakua, the corporation either is giving you strength on your Amakua or is paying a credit, is sort of forced to pay a credit just to make their ice somewhat relevant. And that's such a large accumulating advantage over the course of the game. It ends up being really hard to justify playing other runners when you can play 419 in Criminal. But that's sort of it for Criminals. Moving on to Shaper, there are almost no cards in Standard to talk about for Shaper. Shaper has been in a really kind of dark place for quite a while now, with the only powerful ID, Haley, sort of warping the whole faction and what power budget was allowed to be put into the Shaper card pool. And Haley just rotated. So Shaper's still in sort of a weird rebuilding period where they have to redefine what they do now that the main card and main economic engine that ID sort of worked with just lost a bunch of its power. So there are really only 2 cards that I want to say are like standard defining. So the main Shaper card that you will see in Standard is as you play several games of it is Ngolo. Ngolo is a sort of pseudo AI breaker because of its ability to paint and turn something into a code gate, and then it being able to very efficiently break high strength ice. Ngolo is a great universal breaker for Shapers, and then you'll also see it out of faction as well, just because of how good it is to install a single breaker and be able to get into a lot of remotes, especially single ice remotes. At some premium cost, it breaks, basically Ngolo is going to break almost every ice for about 6 credits. Some ice a little bit less, some ice a little bit more, but you being able to universally turn your money into accesses is a really powerful effect as the runner. So Ngolo has been sort of one of the main power cards for Shaper, so much so that you'll often see it in other factions. And part of the reason you don't see a lot of Shaper is because there's not that many Shapers kind of standard. There's not so many strong cards for Shaper in Standard that you can't just like splash the Ngolo out of faction and get all of the other strong cards you see in those other factions. That said, you do have one exciting ID in Shaper right now. I think Tau is actually qualifies as an exciting ID, but you're already familiar with him from Startup. So Wu is sort of a kind of very cool game-changing ID for Shapers, and it makes your ability to access programs incredibly consistent. A lot of Wu decks will play extra turn 1 burst economy, so they can play that burst economy and then pull out SMCs with the Wu ability, and then go and find the programs that they actually want to install with those SMCs. So there's been historically a bunch of different decks and programs that have gotten banned just because Wu is printed, because Wu is able to make an economic engine that is incredibly consistent. Right now, the most consistent thing is to get 1 to 3 Rozekis out on turn 1 and hope that you can somehow convert that into a win down the road, assuming the Corp can't keep up with your speed. Last up for like the meta-defining cards, I have 2 cards, 1 neutral and 1 mini-faction. So the Turning Wheel is sort of a game standard defining card for a lot of runners right now. It allows these sort of value runners to actually close out games. The idea is you can install the Turning Wheel and make your single access runs on HQ and R&D as they're sort of available to you. But as the game gets to the end, if the corporation has gotten a lead, you can leverage the Turning Wheel to get a burst of extra accesses at the end without having to spend influence on or card slots on stuff like Legwork or the Maker's Eye. And the final card I'm going to talk about as sort of standard defining is Apocalypse. This card is pretty wild. Its text is crazy. Run all 3 centrals is a pretty high requirement and make successful runs. And then turn all of your runner cards face down, so they're now installed cards, but they have no text, no types, they're just face down cards, and trash the every installed corporation card. This is pretty crazy. And it sees a lot of play at this exact moment in Standard, and has gone in and out of being top tier to a card to be aware of, and is sort of the biggest runner gotcha. Most runner cards can't be gotchas because the runner has to install them with some kind of telegraphing. Apocalypse is probably the exception. I think Apocalypse is a really interesting card. If you suspect that the runner could be on Apocalypse, Anarchs right now are often on Apocalypse. Sometimes if you're not seeing any influence in a criminal deck, it's something to be aware of, that maybe they're on Apocalypse. Or if you're seeing an Aesop's Pawn Shop discarded out of the faction, it's something to be aware of. A card I didn't mention for Shaper, Out of the Ashes, is also one to keep aware of. As the corporation, if you sense the player is going for Apocalypse, you have a couple of options. One is you can try and prevent the runs. Cards like Border Control are fantastic against Apocalypse because as long as you can judge that they are going for the Apocalypse, which is a tricky thing to do, you can border control them to buy yourself an entire extra turn without being Apocalypsed, unless the runner has some tech to kind of handle for that. The other thing you can do is not overcommit to your board. The thing that Apocalypse really punishes is the Corp having all of their ice installed and no way to recover in their hand, because Apocalypse resets both players' boards. So if you can be ready to set up and keep going, Apocalypse can be just fine for the Corp. It's just a little bit trickier to do so because it's not an effect under the corporation's control. So that sort of wraps up all of the cards I'm like, oh, these are cards you must know about or really should be aware of to have a good time when you start going into Standard. But Standard has a lot of really interesting cards that just aren't quite Standard defining or things you need to be aware of, that I think I'm going to kind of just quickly mention as interesting cards. There are some IDs that I want to throw out there. Particularly Argus is one of the ones that almost made the cut but just didn't quite. Spark is a fun janky ID. SSO and Jemison can be really fun kind of combo or janky IDs. Builder of Nations, if I see you playing this, unsubscribe. For Shaper, we've got a whole archetype that I didn't touch on, which is Stealth. Smoke and Netmarker are the key cards for that. For Anarch, you have some really fun stuff with Alos. For Criminal, you have Los as a sort of more quirky, interesting ID that you can build around. Akiko Nisei never saw basically any play, but is one of my darling IDs. And then you also have the 3 mini factions as the runner. So you've got Sunny, Adam, and Apex, all of which play a little bit differently and have their own sort of mini card pools to pull from. That can be a lot of fun. And there's just a lot of stuff out there. So I really encourage you to, hopefully armed with some idea of what some of the key things to watch out for and be aware of existing, that you can then also dive in and have fun with some of the more niche and interesting cards. I didn't touch on any of the Hive Mind max tools, and that's an incredibly powerful deck that plays a bunch of cards that were bad and not on this list. So I hope you have a lot of fun with Standard. If there's stuff you feel like I missed or stuff that I should have touched on, please let me know. I'm planning to probably update this video again when the next rotation happens, because a bunch of the cards here will come off, and maybe I'll do a sort of more comprehensive summary that includes some cards from Startup, because there are some cards in Startup that got significantly strong. They're significantly stronger in Standard than they are in Startup. But I hope you enjoyed, and have a nice day.